Oh, there hasn't been a kiss from your soft lips. This is not a rose. This is not a rose.
In the Holmes Adventure of the Naval Treaty that was in 1893, Sherlock Holmes took a moment to smell a red rose. And when Watson asked him what he was doing, he said, "This rose is clearly an evidence of divine beneficence." Our highest assurance of the goodness of Providence, I think, comes to rest in the flowers. All other things, our powers, our desires, our food, are really necessary in the first instance, but this rose is an extra. The smell and color of a rose are an embellishment of life, not a condition of it. It is only goodness which gives extras, and so I say we have much to hope from the flowers.
I guess what interested me was some people could probably whip through your book if they were scanners in no time at all and say they'd had a wonderful walk through a greenhouse, through a garden.
The reaction from people will be interesting because they will approach the book and go, oh, what a beautiful book, what a beautiful flower book. And it will be interesting as they're reading through it when you finally start to realize what these beautiful flowers are made out of. It's quite horrifying.
The reaction is not amusement or titillation, it's disgust, it's absolute disgust. And the question is, what's the difference? And I think here, there's also an important connection to our understanding of the difference between, say, the genres of erotica on the one hand and pornography on the other.
You're forced into a kind of zone of shock and horror. It's like having a subliminal message interjected into a spool of film, where for this one brief moment, your mind confronts something that it finds horrifying that it doesn't want to think about, and somehow that seed is planted, and as a result of this art, you're compelled to think about a whole range of difficult issues.
Cuando Heide me planteó la idea de estas flores de carne me impresionó. Entonces decidí tomarlo desde el punto de vista del humor. Pero cuando las vi ya todo cambia, ¿no? Porque adquieren una belleza muy particular y un aspecto muy extraño, sobre todo puestas en la naturaleza. Pero una cosa que pensé de inmediato es en un personaje de Giovanni Papini, que aparece en el libro negro. Este personaje destruía jardines, entraba de noche a los jardines de la gente y destruía todos porque odiaba las flores, siendo como son el órgano reproductor de las plantas. Entonces lo extraño de esto es que son a veces los órganos reproductores de ciertos animales que aparecen transformados en flores, que adquieren toda otra dimensión, porque ya no reproducen nada, sino que copian esa naturaleza y dialogan con ella desde otro lugar. Le da esa sensación de maravillamiento y al mismo tiempo de cierto resquemor, y es al borde del peligro. Mira si te convierten en flores. No sé si no estaría mal, ¿no?
So she's one of these rare beings, it seems to me, who doesn't comment on the world or float by it, but someone who actually takes things and adds to the stock of reality. That's all I'm interested in art as being. If art comments on society, that's very nice for society, but it doesn't move us finally.
I didn't buy them the tongues and started making flowers, but I thought, oh my God, they look like flower petals. And then, as it always works in my creative process, it just stored somewhere in the back of my head. And then I see something else and think, oh my God, I could use that as a petal and this other as an inside part, and it would totally look like a flower. And then I saw in everything petals and stamen.
The whole idea that your art is meant to rot away. It's meant to somehow tie into the cosmic feeling of the evanescence of life and the beauty that is momentarily produced and then goes, and that while it's there, certain things happen as a result. Well, that's exactly the same, I realized, as what happens with real flowers, because they are nothing but a momentary illusion that will draw the insects in and create the next generations, and then it will fall apart and rot.
Human beings are beautiful, and human beings are quite ugly. And flowers, to my mind, are neither of these things. I think that flowers are quite apart from human beings. I think that there's such a thing as flower power. Heide Hatry's work made me first of all think about cemeteries and the ways in which they tend to be floral bedecked, and how, in part, that effulgence of greenery and bloom is about distracting us from rot. And I love the way in which, in this work, she brings together the beautiful and the rotten.
I mean, it's a kind of stunning artistic project. And I have, as you do, a visceral connection to flowers. There's a tactile connection to looking at flowers for me. It's as if I'm feeling them at the same time. And with flowers, because they're living things, the color of flowers seems to have an extra force on me. And of course, your work combines this sense of life and transient, you know, I think very deeply. The fact that flowers are living things and that they also die makes me think that in a way a garden is a kind of supervising of these motions of life and death.
I think there also is an interesting psychology of our reaction to animal parts. And it's complicated because animal parts represent two things to a member of Homo sapiens. One, it's something to eat. It's you are what you eat, and if you want to build all this animal flesh, the most obvious ingredient is other animal flesh. But even though animal flesh is an ingredient for our own flesh, it also can be highly dangerous because it can be a source of pathogens, diseases, germs. It seems to me a flower made out of animal parts has this wonderful kind of push and pull and tension and conflicting reactions, because one part of the brain reacts to it as we would to a flower, an object of attraction and beauty and harmlessness. Another part might react as we do to animal parts with disgust.
There was a lot of material I used from the sea because it's just perfect. Look, I used, for example, these legs for quite a few of the flowers. Also this you will recognize in flowers. And this stuff. This I used for a flower. And there is another one which is wonderful. Memo Penisbaum.
I remember that in the invention of the telephone, there was in Watson's autobiography a critical moment which he kept on lacing with the mention of a morning glory, and that the telephone, which was somehow linked to this affection for a particular brand of flower called the morning glory, clued us into the relation to mourning that technology and the invention of positive technologies often carry with them. So I was very enthralled by the morning glory. It's such a perfect name to indicate the glorification, the glory, the praise of a kind of Trauerarbeit, or work of mourning, that is so prevalent in the work of Derrida and others.
There are two opposite dangers in thinking, which is somehow evocative of flowers. One way is to mechanize them too much. For example, to cut them up from in pieces and put them in vases, or to use them as decorative elements. The other way to respond to flowers is by killing them immediately, but somehow resuscitating them that nature itself can be recognized.
Plant imagery has been used for millennia. Plants themselves were used as the medium. Egyptian papyrus dating back thousands of years. But getting closer to the kind of things that you were doing, to actually use the plants, there was a technique called nature printing that was initially developed in the 18th century, where they would actually use the plant specimen to print from. There's this wonderful book by a guy named Niphoff, done in Germany in the mid-18th century. And you can see how the plants were actually used, and there's this three-dimensional quality, and they're just beautiful flowers. And he did several hundred of these, and took him a lifetime. But, you know, the kind of things that you do, you know, combining animals and plants into different forms is an idea that's, you know, a lot of people have toyed with. You know, there's some wonderful Victorian books. I have one here. This is not botanical. It's called Grotesque Animals. And basically, the guy, E.W. Cook, he would take bits and pieces of different animals and combine them into these weird critters. You got a mandrel's face, a rhino's horn, a zebra's body, the tail of I guess that's a lemur's tail.
And here, that looks quite flowery, look.
I love this idea. You can almost attach it to the idea of a really perverse take on the ready-made. She's taking the sort of unmade of the animal body and returning it into a ready-made that then she transforms. And like Duchamp, she uses titles in a very witty way and kind of embeds them in puns. And it's that interrelationship that produces these hybrid objects that are both flower, animal, they're both beautiful, they're both horrific.
Eso también hay ahí ya que es cosa freudiana. Las herencias de Heide que se juntan en esta obra. El padre matarife de chanchos, padre que tiene este matadero de chanchos donde hace trabajar a sus hijos y estas bellas jóvenes trabajando ahí matando chanchos, pelándolos, haciendo lo que deben hacer, y la madre que amaba las rosas. Y hay una unión entre el padre y la madre en estas rosas de carne.
I find nature to be indifferent, commonplace, repetitive, pointless, futile, in a way that the products of humanity at least aspire not to be. The fact that you're interested in actual flowers does perplex me. But the art that you've made I don't think has anything to do with that. And I think in fact it corroborates my view of the world more than the one you want to claim for yourself. I think that the détournement of these flowers, the twisting them to some other purpose, the attempt to make them visible when they are in fact invisible in normal life is evidence of a similar realization about the world, that most of it is pure indifferent matter.
It's very beautiful, and one of the things that contemporary theory, particularly semiotics, seems to avoid is anything having to do with beauty. Everything is some abstruse abstraction, and if it's talking about something beautiful, that's never the focus of the issues being raised. So that's going to be very challenging with your new work, that these are beautiful things, and of course they so deeply relate to all the phobias about our bodies, particularly the horrific phobias about the female body.
I know about slaughterhouses, they're terrible. So it's amazing that you can use these parts and make something beautiful out of them. It's wonderful. That's a really good thing to do.
The whole flower aspect of the work is interesting because flowers invite us. And so you've got this thing that is at once, fragile and vulnerable. And at the same time, it becomes dangerous and menacing. And I hesitate to use the word shocking because I know that that's not the way you think about it, but I think, that there's this element that any time that you show them, something like this, there's always an element of sort of shock.
I think shock, even though you're right, I'm not interested in shock, is a necessary part of work when you want to make people look at something. If you realize that there is something disturbing, really disturbing, you might start to think about it.
This is one of the reasons I find, for my own artistic development, Heide's work, sorry to speak about you in the third person even though you're here, your work, to be so valuable is because it makes sense post this era where art claims to shock. It almost uses that idea that art should shock in order to draw out beauty, which is, I think, an incredibly intricate way to create.
When I met Heide, as I wrote in my essay, I was seeking this ancient archetype Inanna, which is how the ancients, the Sumerians, viewed Venus, was this goddess Inanna, who was self-declared queen of heaven and earth. She was a pre-patriarchal goddess, meaning she didn't confine to this patriarchal image of what a woman should be. And she was just highly erotic. She combined the opposites in her erotic attraction. And she was feared and loved. And she was the essence of what the creative force is about, this struggle to integrate the opposites. So Heide, being a Gemini, and who she is, a force of nature, very much, I felt she was a living image. Her art was the residue of her process of the female process of entering this archetype as we enter the age of Aquarius. So it's been a 7-year process with Heide. It's been unbelievable. It feels like it's reached a real culmination now with this flower. It's an 8-sided rosette, which is the symbol of Inanna. It's in these leaves that are red and green. I mean, the red is like blood here in this image. So it just feels like blood splattered on these leaves. So this has like been a real birth, a difficult birth, trying to bring this energy into an embodiment in ourselves and also in our art and also as a form, a living, breathing thing in the art world. And from there into the collective consciousness.
You told a great analogy that I love so much. And you said something like, if there are flowers in a meadow, we can go out and we can enjoy the flowers in the meadow. A composer
that idea, yes,
is like a flower arranger, because you go into the meadow and you just take certain flowers and you lean them against each other in a special way.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about music, you're talking about flower arrangement, it's pretty much the same thing, which is that art is artificial. The boundary is clear. When you go into the field, you see the flowers and they're beautiful, but they don't have an aesthetic quality to them. And we, as lovers of art, all of us, look for something that's not natural. If we were interested in what was natural, we wouldn't need artists. If we were just looking for what's beautiful, we could just look at flowers in the meadow. What we look for are arrangements of dead flowers. Likewise with sounds and with music, we're not looking to just hear beautiful sounds. We're looking for sounds arranged to not be natural.
Of course, we know that in the Renaissance, artificial was a compliment. It meant that you were an artificer. The highest thing you could say about somebody was that they were artificial. And that might be something to reconsider, in that artifice is a natural continuation of the process that we call nature, because nature is artifice in itself.
When I was a child, I read a very popular book for children called The Flower Fairies, and it was all about how every flower had its own little guardian spirit. But back then, you know, human culture seemed pretty small, even in my youth, compared with now. Jungles were enormous, forests were vast. Nature still seemed to be this incredible, abundant force everywhere, which we were allowed to live on the planet just by, if we behaved and kept in cities. Well, that's all changed. nature's been routed, we've won. And Heide's flowers are really possessed. I sometimes think maybe they're a little bit angry. The new flower fairies are, I think, bent on revenge, and as they deserve. I spoke with a famous anthropologist who told me, he said, Anthony, he said, we've ruined the world in our lifetime. And I think it's true, it's absolutely true. And but I take comfort in Heide's flowers.
This is not a rose. This is not a rose. This is not a rose. This is not a rose.